All right, good afternoon. This is the July meeting of the Budget Committee of the Board of Estimate and Taxation. The first item on the agenda this evening is a progress report on IT. And we
Okay, thank you. I'm going to just hand a very short handout.
As long as you're doing it electronically, we're okay.
Well,
Thank you.
that was my backup.
Okay, all
I'm
right.
shocked we don't have this electronic.
Actually, I do have it.
You do?
but I
Okay.
think it's being reinterpreted.
Okay.
It's been around.
get a stiff neck here, looking backwards over our shoulders.
Absolutely.
Here, I'll take half. The other half.
Okay, so what I've given you is just some highlights. I have a bigger deck, but I think those are the most important pieces. Also wanted to introduce you to Jake Ellis, who we just brought in about a month ago
Hey, Jake.
as a solution specialist. And I'm really going to split up my talk into talk about infrastructure projects, and then we'll talk about solutions types of projects. And as you might imagine, being here for a month, we're sort of in infancy of the solutions projects. But I think we have a good story to tell there as well. So I'll start on, like I said, infrastructure projects. And the first one is the re-architecture of the municipal area network and internet access. And we have now ended a 14-year relationship with Lightpath and leveraged the state agreement with FiberTech. So for the next 5 years, we have now FiberTech connecting 29 sites. And we went from a hub and spoke architecture of 1 gigabyte shared to now a dual ring architecture with 10 gigabit. The old network was sort of this small ring with spokes to the sites, and it did mean that any outage or any loss of connection would spell certain disconnects for other locations and the one nearest to it. And with the ring, we're much more resilient to a single break. Again, the old network was fully managed by Lightpath, and it gave us very little control in IT over the management of it. So that's changed dramatically now. We have a lot of control over the network, and essentially what we did is leased dark fiber, so it's dedicated, and then we had FiberTech lighted as well. So there's certain layers that FiberTech still runs, but we have a larger control. The good news is we're saving significant money as well, about $100,000 a year. So for the life of that contract, about $500,000. Just kind of going through some highlights here. So we have 29 sites on these 2 rings. There's some overlap between the rings. What we call the black ring runs north of town, and the green ring, we still rely on a point-to-point connection from Town Hall to Todd's Point, and now we have a new fiber optic underground connection to Board of Ed, which we will use for voice over IP, and we also now use, and if you look at the chart I had for you right here, which is we now have a new internet provider, which is the state of Connecticut, and we're saving considerable money there as well. And what we are utilizing is now underground fiber, and the state provides point of access at the library, town hall, and they had previously provided it to Board of Ed, so that stays the same. So
Is there a savings there?
So there's a savings of about $50,000 a year. And that's when I also include bringing in, so in our DR site at Witherall, we're going to bring in another internet provider. So even doing that, it's about $50,000 a year. Even though we haven't finished that part of it yet, but that's where we're going next. But we are off Lightpath completely. We used to have Lightpath for internet and the municipal area network, so we're off. What's the next? Then the next step is for the data center, I want to bring in what I call a monitoring station, which is a station within the data center where we're going to have a lot of monitors and take all of the measurements of whether it's the network or the health of the applications or the servers themselves or the internet connection, and bring that forward so that the staff has that at their fingertips. We know what normal looks like, and therefore we know what abnormal looks like. We know how to recognize things quicker. So it's really had this vision for a while to get the right measurements in front of us so that we can, and when I finish this, you'll have a tour as well. This is not an expensive endeavor. Most of the measurements exist, but it's the new add is that we're going to bring it out and expose those measurements, so those dashboards, so to speak, so you can see it. So I'm very excited about that because I think that's really going to change our reaction time and our attention to any slight variations on the performance of the networks or the applications or just generally the health of operations. Back to another project, IT disaster recovery. We engaged a company, R. Dorsey, off a federal contract.
I'm sorry, what's the name again?
R. Dorsey.
R. Dorsey.
So, again, they had a federal contract for disaster recovery type of operations. And again, I just want to also remind everyone that this was very narrowly focused. This is an IT disaster recovery project. It was for any disruption in the data center downstairs to make sure we have a plan for engaging our disaster recovery site at Nathaniel Witherall. And with that, we engaged R. Dorsey and said, first of all, take a look at what we're doing and make an assessment before we go and make a plan. And they did that. And as part of that plan, we identified what we thought our key services were, our priority of services that IT provides. And that's the slide and the highlights. That's this. It was a very useful exercise, but what it really brought about is that the internet is our #1 service priority. Because not only for obvious reasons, but for example, Munis runs in the cloud, and now email will be running in the cloud. So there's quite a few key services that just run outside, and so the internet's really popped up as the #1 service priority. And then the interconnectivity between the locations is #2. Email shows up as 3. You can start arguing now which one's jockey for position, but that's where we settled for. And then we really just tried to tier these to say, in a disaster type of situation, what will we prioritize as bringing back online? So this isn't for normal days, if something goes out, how long would it be to bring this back? But this is just the beginnings of our roadmap for how do we restore service. And our plan will be predicated on this type of document. So I included it because I think it's an interesting document to look at. So email, I think you're somewhat familiar, being the pilot group, of where we are with that. I will tell you we've now converted the RTM accounts that we had with the old provider, and we're working and now reaching out to boards and commissions and trying to move everybody that had an existing Lotus Notes account on that outsourced Lotus Notes server so that we can abandon that and from there start to migrate over police, fire, and then each of the town departments. In the area of mobile device management, we are pushing out a solution that's part of Office 365. We are training the IT staff, and we're looking to implement mobile device management for any mobile device that runs a town service. Usually it's email, but it can be other applications as well. In the area of cybersecurity fortification, in your packet I put some quotes. I thought these were kind of interesting. I mean, so, what struck me with a lot of these is that while the idea that cyber crime is persistent, the technology is dynamic and keeps changing, and there are lots of cyber criminals who are actively looking to commit crime, and usually there's more of those than there are people to protect. And the other piece I wanted to really bring across is that crime, as a physical crime that we know it is more progressively becoming more technical in nature. And if you go to the next page, what I'm really trying to emphasize here is that cybercrime is crime. And sometimes we think because it's technical and forget, but cyber theft is actually theft, and ransomware is extortion, and Trojans and viruses are vandalism. And every organization deals with this all the time. So what I will ask again this year for the budget cycle is some sort of help, some sort of resource to focus on it. Because while physical crime in the United States is going down, cybercrime is going up. And I would, then again, I will ask for help. That is not help for an expert that I think, Jim, you brought up last time. We wouldn't be able to afford an expert, but it's somebody who can focus, that we can train. So somebody in the physical world that might be a first responder or an investigator in the cyber world would kind of take on that same role. So it's to help us fight cybercrime while at the same time trying to support systems. And it's an issue that I'll bring up every year because I see it as it's progressively getting worse.
Can I ask you a question,
Sure.
Tom? And we've had this discussion before, so I'm curious about your latest thinking. You know, our Barry Dunn study that we did a few years ago suggested that particular function could be outsourced or best be outsourced, but I think your view has more been we need a person in-house who's dedicated to that. So help me understand
Sure.
why that is.
Well, okay, yeah. I mean, to go back, we do have a lot of tools, right? So there's no shortage of tools. We have a next generation firewall. We have intrusion protection. We have spyware. We have antivirus, zero-day threat protection, URL filtering. We have a company that's dedicated to maintain those, so to make it their job to go out and say what's the latest websites that we shouldn't go to and where's the latest zero-day threat. So there are companies that are actively doing that. They're not necessarily engaged in the well. If you think of crime fighting on a local level, the activities of training the staff all the time on the latest threats, because again it's dynamic and it changes, or changing or investigation. So, for example, we will every once in a while somebody will fall into a phishing scheme, and the damage that happens is protected because we lock down the workstations enough that you really can't do too much damage outside the workstation. So we'll wipe it, and we will image a new workstation for that. Most of the data is kept on drives, and we have backups. But you know, we don't necessarily investigate it the way that if we had a dedicated resource we would, to where is this coming from. And we generally we do know where this is coming from, and then somebody will put a patch on it, and that'll be the end of it. But I'd like to see it more of what's the let's just not fix it each time it happens. Where how do you get ahead of this? And there are people that in my mailbox on any given day is an invitation to a cyber conference. I could spend every day of the week going to a cyber conference and learning more and getting certifications. But I'd much rather have somebody who send to these things and get smarter in it. And again, I think it's going to keep growing, and at some point we will. I think we will do it. Just it's a matter of when.
But Mary Lee's question was whether or not the question of whether or not to outsource it or to do it in-house.
Well, I think most of the outsourcers tend to be of the mind of, let's look through all your operations and then we'll tell you what to fix, and then go ahead and fix it, and then go away, and then things change and you have to kind of re-engage. So the consultants I've seen are they come in, they fix things, and they leave. And I guess it's possible to have somebody that you pay to kind of do that work, but the work I'd like to see is every day. So I guess it would be a full-time consultant. So I could certainly look into that, but that's it would be a company and so forth. But I do think there's a value of having somebody who understands the environment. I think with a consultant you could a month later have somebody that gets replaced, and now you have somebody else who's trying to understand the environment, because it's not necessarily security in a vacuum. It's security of knowing, or even they ask you questions. What processes are we doing that are dangerous? I don't mean just as IT, but what processes do we do in every department that may be capturing, for instance, information that we don't need to capture? And even as an approval process, if you want to do a certain thing, maybe it needs to clear a security hurdle the same way. If you want to pay a bill, it needs to pass a financial hurdle. But I could certainly make more of a case for it, but that's what I don't see is security being part of a process here. And it's reactionary versus a proactive. So again, what we do now is we have lots of tools. We limit the workstations, and we perform multiple layers of backups. So we can go back to, for instance, we have full backup every night to Nathaniel Witherall, and then on top of that we have tapes as well. So we can always go back. And then also there are certain things that are, for instance, in a year from now, by the end of this calendar year, email will be in the government cloud, Microsoft's government cloud. So that will be one less thing that we as a town have to concern ourselves with. But I do think there's still, there's certainly room for a virus to get through Microsoft's email and show up in a town workstation and still wreak its havoc. So it's not going to go away, but it's just maybe some of the exposure will be lessened. The next piece I'll talk about is voice over IP. So this is a project that I inherited in February, and about 4 days after I inherited it, we rolled out VoIP phones to Town Hall, and did it during a snowstorm, and it worked. I think we made the right call to do it during a snowstorm, because it would have cost more money to cancel all those plans and then wait a month and re-engage. So we took our chances, and we huddled around. The vendors were confident it could be done, so we did it. The next pieces are we need to implement what's called the SIP piece of this, and this is for outgoing calls. And then we need to implement the call accounting system, and this is so we can historically look back. If somebody wants to investigate who's made certain calls, we can go and get that information. We need to implement at Nathaniel Witherall, at the library, and perhaps the largest endeavor is going to be police and fire. And then we'll do the other locations. And so I provided you this because it's a diagram that we drew up before we started meeting with police and fire to talk about the replacement of their PBX, which will actually be the backup for the town as well. And their PBX has connectivity to so many other systems that I wanted to make sure that we thought them through. And so while, for example, we're not replacing the 911 system, there are dispatchers that have headphones that not only can take 911 calls and radio, but also can pick up admin calls from the telephone system through this PBX. So when we replace it, that needs to work as well. So these are things that, by drawing this out and having lots of discussions, these types of of connections came through, and so we could talk about them without them being surprises. And so there, but I just want to share that with you to kind of give you a sense of the detail that we get into. And we're looking for a September timeframe. At the same time the fire portion of the safety complex is done, that's when we want to roll and change out the PBX. And pretty much everything you see in red, the backup PBX and the SIP trunks and voicemail and so forth. So that's that piece. So for me, that's the whole infrastructure, where we've been, where we're going. And so on the third page of the packet, I have what's called solutions projects. And I figured that Jake and I can talk about those a little bit. But the most immediate one that's coming up is CityView implementation in the building department. And you might have heard about this one before, but right now the building department uses a product called Cornerstone, which is unsupported, has been so for years, relies on unsupported equipment because it has a voice aspect of it where you can call up and you can schedule inspections. But the way that the system's so old and unsupported that we have to keep very old hardware in place to keep it going. So from an IT perspective, we've been wanting to replace the system for a while. CityView is in use at the health department, at planning and zoning, and at wetlands. So if we can get CityView to work for the building department, this is the prerequisite for being able to do things like online permitting and do some basic automation and online capabilities that other towns are doing, and I think we can as well. But we have to get past this point. So we re-engaged the building department and I was working on this for about a year to get down to brass tacks exactly what would have to change in CityView in order to replace Cornerstone. And it was very specific down to certain reports that need to be run and certain way information needed to be recorded. So we amended the contracts, issued a PO, and we're scheduled to begin that in September. So that's the beginnings of what, and it'll, not only will we still have a voice piece where a resident can call and get an inspection, but we also want to implement a web piece where you can go online and you can the same way you can book tea time, you could book an inspection.
Tom,
Mm-hmm.
This reminds me of the presentation that Ben just made about Six Sigma and rethinking processes throughout
Mm-hmm.
town government, just everywhere, every type, including this one. But the question from our perspective would be, again, what are the savings? I mean, is there headcount that can be saved? Is there part-time or temporary help that can be saved? Is there efficiencies that are going to be achieved here when we do start online permitting that we can see in dollars?
Well, I won't know yet until we go through the process. But I mean, you're right, and Ben's right in that the process is really the process change. It's process first, and tools second.
Mm-hmm.
And so, right now we couldn't even, we own this CityView portal, web portal, but we couldn't even use it because our processes are not even close to being accommodative of how the portal works. So it's based on our existing systems are based on resident walking plans around, and if that process doesn't change, there's not too much you can do electronically to walk something around for a resident. I mean, well, that would be the point. You want to be able to
Right.
pass it around. But if you can't pass it around physically now, I'm not saying this clear enough. If we're not willing to say, let me take this plan from you and pass it around on your behalf, paper-wise, as a process, it's going to be very difficult to automate something that by its very nature electronically would pass it around on your behalf. Because I think we can all at least envision what we think online permitting would be. It would be something you go online to ask for the permit, follow the progress as it happens electronically, and not necessarily be a participant unless there's questions being asked of you. But that's a big process change. Now, if that process happens, will there be savings? I imagine so, but I'm not even quite sure we're going to get to the process change. I'm certainly, because we haven't started that yet.
So what's your time frame? When can I ask this question again?
Well, number one is the prerequisite. We have to replace CityView with, and maybe I haven't been clear about that, replacing CityView with Cornerstone is simply a legacy replacement.
The other way around.
Another way.
Replacing
you.
Cornerstone with CityView.
Well, you've all been paying attention.
We have.
Prerequisite to anything. So, and I think we will find some process change along the way there, but
Okay.
that's just the beginning work that enables us to then have the more serious conversations about, okay, how do we change fundamentally the way permits are applied
Right.
for? And that could mean things, for example, if you need to make sure that your contractors are licensed, right now somebody needs to look that up. It is possible to have a process look that up to a state database and come back with an answer, but that has to technically be built and also accepted as a process, as a new process. And that, in my opinion, has to be negotiated with the department heads to make sure that they are all in agreement that a new, more efficient process would serve the residents better. And if it does, then I think we can automate that. And if it serves the residents better, I do think it would make us more efficient and there would be cost savings. But I couldn't sit here right now and tell you what I think those are.
Okay, so we'll keep asking, I guess. I see Ben
Absolutely keep
nodding,
asking.
and we'll just keep asking when and how it's going.
Yeah, no, I think I would be misrepresenting it if I said we're going to bring in this software and save X amount of dollars, or because I don't know yet. But it doesn't mean that we shouldn't try and begin that process.
But, question, and I just follow on from Mary Lee's, under other circumstances, say the private sector, would a change like this be initiated by the IT department? Or would it be initiated by the leadership of the departments or someone above them, to basically say, this is in our interest and these are the kind of things that you need to be thinking about in order to, make this an efficient process and deliver the services to a higher level, and we're going to provide the, IT support for this. I mean,
You're absolutely correct. That is, I couldn't agree. Thank you for saying that too, because that's exactly right. Where it is, it's the process first to tools second. I can't necessarily change processes that I don't own. And in IT, I don't own business processes. I can work with those owners, who are the department heads, to change the process and then help support that new process with new technology. But that's why I can't tell you, as not the process owner, of what could be changed with the technology. It's a pure negotiation with those departments.
Because they report to a commission, or because?
Sometimes they report to commissions, they report to the first selectman,
Right.
but they don't report to me. And
Right.
so I always look at it that I'm playing the supporting role, and the department heads are really the stars. And I was part of the lean training, and I was really happy to see that reinforced. That it's not the technology is going to come in and change process on you. You're going to change the process. Technology is going to help.
The department is very comfortable with cornerstones. I mean, my guess is that they will not leap to the idea of changing to a CityView program if you left it up to them.
Well, I don't think anybody's ever running up and saying, yes, let's change my world or change everything I know. But I haven't found them resistant either. I mean, they sat in a lot of meetings trying to nail down exactly what would need to change. So I was very impressed that the days they spent working with the vendor to nail down exactly what needed to change. So
A few years ago, the person who's presently the department head of planning and zoning expressed a concern that she was uncertain whether or not CityView was going to continue to be actively supported by the company that owns it. Are you pretty comfortable at this point that CityView is going to be well protected?
well, it certainly
Well
changed.
supported?
It changed hands a few times for sure. No, it's been stable. I think there's always that risk though with some of these smaller, not Oracle, not Microsoft players that change hands. But I've found them so far to be stable. So that's that piece.
If I may add on, you were asking about cost savings. One of the places that you'll actually see cost, but maybe we can get back to you on the amounts, would be this replacement of Cornerstone, because of the cost that we have to incur on one, the physical server being downstairs, and two, the disaster recovery piece over in Witherall. Those two pieces, I believe one of them, the one at Witherall, was bought on eBay. They're no longer supported. So those two pieces alone is actually going to help us save some cost.
Okay.
If you want us to get back to you on that, we can. Great. Sure.
Yeah, we did. We actually, it was part of the disaster recovery where we looked, and Cornerstone was on our top 10 or top 12, somewhere you see it in there. But and we said, wow, we really need to have something at Witherall, so we have an exact copy of the system downstairs at Witherall. And yeah, we did go to some funny sources to buy retro equipment to make sure it still worked. That was sort of the deal. Was I'm going to do my best to support this, but the building department has to do their best to try to get into something new, and we struck a good agreement that way. So yeah, there will be some savings in just purely modernizing, and it's worth it just for that piece. But what you're talking about, which is the process change that we need to make lots of process change, to Leslie's point, it begins with the departments. And I think we have a lot of department heads.
Yeah, this
That
was
was
the
it.
process which the survey indicated when we surveyed users was the least liked process in the town.
Oh, I bet.
They like the cops better.
Well, yeah, and I have
So,
to say,
we can't, it's not the budget committee's issue to try to figure out how to do things, but
yeah, no,
that's something that there's been a lot of unhappiness with for a long time.
yeah, and as a resident too, it's something I'd like to see
Yeah, it's-
change as well.
Right. It's not just builders, it's individual homeowners who can't get their projects done because they're lost in the process somewhere. It's a little like riding the MTA, if you remember that song.
Never returned.
Yeah. So I mean, I think that's the exciting part about a project like this is it's the process, the idea that the process can change. Not so much the technology, but
Or we could give better service to the citizens.
yeah, that would be the payoff.
Okay. We're
let-
a few more minutes. and then
Sure.
we-
So let's stay about the town site redesign. So there was a survey done by UConn about a year ago. First Selectman had that done where a number of departments that came back that residents were unhappy because they couldn't find information they wanted. But what was missing from my point of view was whether they couldn't find information because it didn't exist, or they couldn't find information because it was just not well presented. I suspect it's a little bit of both. So we are finalizing an online survey, which will seek to ask those types of questions. What are you generally looking for? Did you find it? What I'm trying to figure out is there information that's difficult to find or not present? And you should also think about, from a resident's point of view, there is the town website, which appears to be one big entity, but more realistically, think of it as an ecosystem. meaning you go to the main page, and there are core pages that are supported by a content management system, but many times you click on something and you go off to something else. For example, when you get your beach pass, you go to something called WebTrack. Or in parking, you go to another application. But yeah, I think most people think of it as one big website where it's really an ecosystem. So I do think that the survey might start pointing out that there might be some deficiencies there as well. And I think that's going to inform capital requests coming up. So it might be under the umbrella of website design, but there might be more to it than just changing out the look and feel of the content management system in. So we're looking at that, and I want to get the results in time to inform what I should be asking for. We can go through a little bit more, but I guess we can talk about what else? Application upgrades maybe is the... So we typically, well, maybe the most important thing is we have a lot of access databases that were developed a long time ago, and I'd like to see them replaced, and either replace it with more modern technology or look to see what systems do we have now where it just might fit into, and we don't have to go any further. And actually a good example was something that Jake just worked on, where when you register your alarm, so if you have an alarm system and you go to register it, there still is an access database that keeps track of it, and it's not a great system for a variety of reasons. One is it actually needs technical intervention every year to reset it to who paid and who didn't pay, and just things that a system we shouldn't have to do. And Jake met with the police who keep track of this and figured out you could use a system that they already own that has alarm registration, and kind of began them on the journey, and he's going to work with them to move that to an existing system we already owned, and it's one less system we have to support. So there's a few of those access databases. Another one keeps track of vaccinations for the health department, and we're looking at Client Track for social services, which is already in place to do that work as well. So that's I think it's going to be like a marathon, not a sprint, because there's about 8 or 9 different access databases, but I think slowly we're going to move them and not have to support them, and that'll free up some resources in IT to do other things. So, I mean, I could certainly answer questions. Hopefully all that was clear.
As soon as we understood it.
Did you cover these 2 other bullets, imaging and archiving and?
No, I skipped them,
You
but
skipped
we can, you want to talk about?
Not for long.
Okay, that's why I kind of jumped to the highlights and wanted to leave some time for questions, but.
I ask because respectfully, we do see boxes of paper in certain areas of
For
town hall.
document management?
Right, and so,
Well, I would tell you, for document management, we are bringing in a consultant, and we're just looking at best practices at this point, without buying any new modules or any other software. The one that always comes to mind is, are we very mindful of the documents we're scanning? Should I scan a document only to pass it to you, and then you're scanning it as well? And it's those kinds of conversations. Having really nothing to do with the vendor, it's all about process, again. So I think those things will come up. So lots of... So we're mindful of that, but that's in its infancy right now, and it'll start up.
Other questions? So I have one question. I just want to make sure I understand something you said at the beginning. We're now getting all 100% of our internet capability off the state network?
Yes.
And how does that physically get to us? Come into this building, does it?
It comes in this, so what happens is the state gave us a point of presence in Town Hall, and they did that through the fiber that we installed that goes to something called a MUX at the Board of Ed, which then goes off to the state network. So another way of thinking about it is from the state internet, it comes to the Board of Ed, where they have this, it's basically a prism, it's called a MUX, and it takes some of the spectrum, puts it to the Board of Ed, some of the spectrum comes under the Greenwich Commons to here, the other goes under Greenwich Commons through the parking garage into the library. So each of the three entities really have their own internet connection with the state.
But it all comes from one place.
It all comes from one place, which...
So if that goes down, what happens?
Right now, if that goes down, we, which is why we're putting another internet connection at Witherall for that very thing. So right now, we would have a problem. But Board of Ed's been configured that way for 2 years, and they haven't. So that is our very next thing is we're putting this another internet connection at Witherall, and we would just divert right to there.
And that supports not just internet connection, but all the telephone systems, including the public safety telephone systems?
No, the telephone systems are and public safety is different because the SIP trunking is an internet connection. So telephone traffic does not go over the internet. Telephone traffic would go from location to location on our municipal area network, but the SIP trunking is how it goes out. So to be a little bit more clear, is the police would have their own, in a sense, internet connection out for calls. And by the way, 911 the state 911 has nothing to do with what we were just talking about. That has their own connection as well. So the town has their own SIP trunking, and so does the Board of Ed. So there's multiple, it's called survivability, and there's survivability built into the schools and the police and the town for phones.
Well, maybe somewhere along the line, we could try to understand that better.
Yeah, I could certainly, I didn't know that was a concern,
Well, sure, it's a concern.
I know it's a concern, but I didn't know it was a particular, so I can definitely get into more details about it.
Okay.
But just know that the one internet connection through the state, there's no calls going through that. Nor
Okay.
will there be.
And we don't need that connection for the phone system to run internally.
We do not need that system through the state for the phone system to run. We need the municipal area network for
That's
phone.
not the state.
That's not the state.
And you have some backup for the municipal area network.
We do in that you could, if we lost municipal area network, you could still make outgoing calls from police to town hall, for example, or from the school to police or anywhere else, because you could make outgoing calls, because there are connections that called SIP trunking, but it's not internet.
Okay. Good. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Joe.
Thanks,
Okay.
Tom.
Thank you.
The next item on the agenda is to talk a little bit more about the budget guidelines. Roland had sent out some spreadsheets of various kinds. Maybe Roland, you can hand out some hard copies of those, and we can talk about them a little bit.
Thank you, Ron.
So we have two kinds of things here, and I just want to emphasize that what we're trying to do at this stage of the game is provide data to stimulate thought, headed in the direction of having draft budget guidelines for fiscal 18 in September. So you have two completely different things. One is a set of the big spreadsheet that you're used to seeing with some different assumptions about what the guideline might provide, so you can see the impact of the guideline. And then you have this two-page handout which talks about capital projects. Let me come to the capital projects in a minute. Is there anything you want to say about the big spreadsheets here?
No, other than a couple of things stay the same on there, and that is the capital tax levy increase and the pension contribution in healthcare.
Stayed the same
We
as,
have been using. So it's not a function of, is it 1% or 1.5%?
No, okay. But it's your forecast for fiscal 18?
Yes.
So let's just take a quick look at this. Those of you on the BET are used to seeing this, so the form hasn't changed here. If you look at the top sheet, in the top center in the dark black box, it says financing requirement .0275. Okay, so this just assumes that the guideline turns out to be a 2.75% increase as opposed to this past year when it was 2. And if you look at the next page, it's 2.5%, and the page after that, it's 2.25%, and then it's 2, and then it's 1.75, and then it's 1.5. Guess we didn't run 1.
I think I had asked that we could run one,
Yeah.
and I think the additional ones that were higher than the initial group that came out were run, but
Okay.
Roland, do you think we could just run one tomorrow and circulate that, please?
1%?
1%?
Okay.
Yeah.
In any case, the easiest way to look at this, I think, is to then look at the box at the bottom of the page, go back to the first page and look at the box at the bottom, and assume for the sake of conversation that you want the mill rate increase to be 2.5%, which is the third line from the top in that box. Then if you give a guideline out for 2.75% and you want the mill rate increase to be 2.5%, this says you have to cut $4,443,981 out of the budget somewhere. That's what it takes to fit the formulas. And because we've been doing this for 15 years, these formulas are actually pretty accurate. There are some other things in here that you might want to draw your attention to. Near the bottom, there's in the left-hand column in dark lettering the word funding.
I'm sorry.
And immediately
Right.
under funding,
Okay, thank you.
it says use of fund balance at June 30th. And in the fiscal 17 budget, that number was $14,441,000. And all Roland has done here is assume that it'll be the same number next year. But if you decide you don't have that much fund balance, let's say you think you have 10 million in fund balance that you can use, then you're short another $4,441,000. So you'd add that to the $4,443,000 and you'd have sort of an $8.9 million challenge as you were pulling the budget together. So now turn a couple pages in till you get to the one that shows 2%. And I'm only drawing you to that one because that's what we told people last year, just so you can kind of see how it plays out. If you go to the 2% number, and in this case, down in the bottom box, use the 2.75% mill rate increase, which is about what the mill rate increase was in the fiscal 17 budget. If you were, right?
Yes.
288.
That's right.
Right, it was 288,
288.
but I don't have 288 here.
Got it.
So I have to pick one. So I'll pick the one that's just a little more challenging. Then instead of 4,000,004, you need to find 2,399,000. You with me?
Yep.
But if you go up to the funding section where we have use of fund balance, it's still 14,000,004. So if you decided you could only use 10, I'm just making that up, you'd still need to find that 4,000,004. Now, if you go a little deeper in to 2 pages on to the 1.5%, let's just suppose we made that the guideline. In that case, that 2.75% mill rate increase says you only need to find 900,000 if you have 14 million in fund balance. So you can begin to see how much these guidelines impact the numbers. And if you happen to be the school superintendent, in the top section up above, you can see how the different assumptions produce different numbers for the school's budget. And because that's sort of half the town budget, sort of half of whatever the challenge is here is going to fall in the school's budget. So it's a shorthand way of kind of looking at what's happening.
I think there's
So-
I think there's an arithmetic glitch, Roland. Can I just direct your attention to something? If you take a look at the second sheet down, the sheet that's at 2.5% of cost change, if you take the mill rate increase that's shown without any of the challenges that Jim was just talking about, the mill rate there is an increase of about 3.5%.
Yep.
If you take a look at the 2.25% increase, the mill rate increase there is 3.3%, slightly over. But then oddly, when you look at the 2%, instead of stepping down further, it steps up to 3.4%. I think that's kind of an arithmetic anomaly. I'm not sure that there's not an error somewhere.
The healthcare is different.
Oh, is that what
The
happened?
models.
Yeah, it
It's- It's all, they're different by 1,000,001.
Oh, I see. So maybe then in the fullness of time, we could run these calculations using all the same healthcare figure. The 51,000, no, I see. Three of the scenarios are at 51,000 and 51 million and change, and three of the scenarios are at 52 million and change. Am I reading that correctly? 62 million and change. Sorry, 61 and 62.
It's the first three and the second three, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah, there's a
that's-
slightly different figure in the assumption.
Yeah.
It's just
They
an
were
error
run
that
at,
crept
they
in.
were run at
Yeah.
different times,
Yeah.
so that's.
Yeah, that's
what
okay, because
happened.
I had contacted Roland and asked if he'd run the first three.
Yeah.
So Roland, one of the things that you have here is property tax revenue going up 3.85% year over year. Is that correct? I mean, I'm just wondering if you could, or it seems to vary too in the sheet, just as Jeff, or 3.96. Is there, how did you sort of land on those numbers for property tax revenues, given, where we
It was-
are?
Oh, yeah. The first three scenarios have different.
0.04.
Yeah.
I'm sorry?
0.04% is what,
You're assuming?
assuming.
For growth in the grand list.
Growth and grand list?
But to pick up on what Leslie just said, three of the scenarios are using one property tax revenue figure, and three of the scenarios are using a
Right.
different one. I mean, it's no big deal, Roland, but it'll,
I'll make them consistent.
yeah, if you make them consistent, yeah.
Yeah, that's what happens when we
Yeah,
do
I'm sorry.
them at
Yeah.
two different times, so.
Can I
So,
make a comment?
Sure.
Just for the superintendent and others who are looking at this maybe for the first time, it's important to note that in order to make the cuts that Jim has directed us to in the boxes on each page, you either have to make it in operating, make it in fixed charges, or make it in this line called the capital tax levy, because that's a fixed amount that goes up by 3 million. So therefore, reducing a project, cutting a project, that doesn't have an impact on the tax rate under our system. Everything adds down in that section to the capital tax levy, which goes up by a fixed amount. We can get into reasons why at another time, but just so you understand the mathematics of this, cut a capital project has absolutely no impact on the mill rate you're looking at in out years when we start to pay for it through debt service. It will. The other observation I would make is, as Jim was directing us to the use of fund balance, we also have a fund balance policy which says that fund balance has to be a certain percentage of the overall budget, to use generic terms. And the overall budget grows over time. So we have to keep track importantly, of this use of fund balance, because it should grow with the budget over time, and at least stay in that range. Our range is 5 to 10% of the general fund budget. So that's just another variable that we stick into this very large multivariable equation that we're looking at here. And then, of course, you'll get to the capital model, but I just want to point out those two sort of interesting aspects of our model.
Fortunately, Mr. Ricky knows it all cold now. He's been through it for a whole 6 months or so. Yeah.
What is the assumption you have for healthcare? Because that's going up only 5%. We need to figure out what we're thinking in that assumption.
Okay, the more accurate number is the one that says 6.2% change. That assumes a year's worth of savings with at least the teachers going in, the state plan. And
It's at 6.9%.
yeah, and because what that assumes is 18% for everyone else, except for the teachers. And that would bring the average down to this number. But that is sort of, that assumes an entire year's of saving. Doesn't assume any give-backs, for example, like sharing those savings. So that's how we get that. And the total saving for a whole year is close to $12 million. And again, that assumes that a whole year without any give-backs anyplace. So that's sort of the maximum benefit that we can get out of it.
So
That's really what it is. Assumes
if
the teachers going in and.
with that number would go up by about 1.3 million.
Yeah.
Does everybody understand? Just
Right.
On the healthcare, because the savings on the teacher contract would be 4.5 million, but the added premium back to that would be 11% bump. Is 3 called 3. So the delta savings is only just a tad more than a million. But that's the way you calculate it.
Yes, it assumes 18% offset by the reduction in $4.8 million for the teacher savings for a whole year.
Yeah,
Yeah.
she's above.
So that, just to say your point a different way, as we think about the guideline that we issue in September, October, we have to decide whether or not we're comfortable with that assumption or some other assumption. Fortunately, we'll know a little more by the time we get there than we know now. And that will impact the numbers down in the big black box on the bottom. And depending on how those numbers look, it will impact what we think the guidance number for the operating budget change should look like. So that's we go around those numbers until we get to a point where we have something we think we want the departments and the Board of Ed to use for planning purposes and budgeting purposes, and then they do that. And let's say everybody exactly conforms, and then we get to the hearings in February, March, April, and May. And by then, we know more than people knew when they were doing their budgets. And we end up, as we did this past year, having to adjust some numbers up and down at the BET before we release the budget to the RTM, and then the RTM does whatever it does. So we have to, this is one assumption. We'll need, because that happens to be a fairly good-sized assumption, we're going to want to know as much as possible by the time we're looking at an actual draft to debate among ourselves in September. Did you have something, Leslie?
I just wanted to ask one clarifying question on what the assumption is that Roma made as other revenue regarding state reimbursement.
The current year budget is going to be short, 1670 is going to be short, I think, $2.4 million to the state. So right now, we're assuming that we're not going to get that, and as of now, something else will replace that.
That 2.4 million is included in other revenue.
Yes.
So that's potentially overstated.
Just as a follow-up, though, because I was looking at the budget, it looked to me like between the SPED and the ECS funding for what was in our approved budget, wondering, should we conservatively assume all of that goes away?
I think,
I just looked at the budget numbers that we had in the approved budget.
Right.
But it didn't all go away, in fact.
Well,
in
it
this
didn't all
year.
go away this year, but the question is.
Whether it'll go away next year.
It's just an interim, we took away whatever percent, this past year, we're going to zero it out as a state next year. This is a transition. I don't know what the reasonable assumption is, but it is $4.5 million.
it's not 4.5. It's-
Between ECS and SPED, it's 4.5, I believe.
The shortfall for 16, 17 is
There's a
2.7.
shortfall, I mean, we're not, but
But
we
if you're
had
saying
in
every-
our budget, if the 53.3 million assumes what's in the budget for SPED and for ECS, I believe that's 3 million in one case and 1.5 in the other, or 4.5 million.
Not for next year. We took that down to 750 and 1.4 and got rid of the pilot. So
Yeah.
that could still be a risk.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. In any case, by the time we get to September, we want to be able to make explicit what we've assumed for
Right,
these
okay.
numbers like this, so that we can decide how much optimism or pessimism we want to build into the guidelines document. And then there'll be another opportunity to update that a couple months later when the departments are getting to the point of finishing up their budgets.
So,
Leslie?
yeah, so, Jim, I think in addition, I'd like, and I'd asked if I could see one at 1%, but also I'd like to have all of us see one with using the assumptions, the Budget Overview Committee / RTM assumptions, so at least we would see what kind of consequences there would be if those assumptions were implemented. I think it's a, good thing to look at. But more specifically here, one of the numbers is the Witherall number. I was surprised to see that number for Witherall in at $3 million. I thought that the town we, the BED, had removed, substantial sums in fixed charges, et cetera. So I would have expected that to have been subtracted from the $3 million number. Why are you continuing to use $3 million? And then I also know, of course, that we have the special committee on Nathaniel Witherall, and I hope at some point, maybe this summer, we'll begin to get some input, but obviously detailed work
Roland?
for the next.
Because when we put the 16, 17 budget together, we still had a $3 million shortfall.
Even after the changes.
And then we also took back, to balance the budget, we reduced the subsidy for the $3 million by $850,000.
Right.
So we're starting off possibly $850 short, plus whatever loss
Right, they have during the
is
year.
going to be in their budget, so.
850 loss, the carryover plus whatever
Right.
Yes.
that exceeds how much we put in there already for this year? Is that what you're saying? Could that possibly be?
Well, we left them with an $850,000 deficit when we
Right.
put together the 16, 17 budget.
Right, I
So if
understand
it comes
that.
out perfect, they're going to be short $850,000.
Right.
So.
Well, I hope they come out more than
With
perfect.
our subsidy of.
No, I
$3 million.
understand that.
Yeah.
But given that we've taken out the, substantial amount of fixed charges and other charges that they had, I would have hoped that would have substantially improved their numbers.
We were estimating what their shortfall was going to be, and then in the end, to meet for certain budget exigencies, instead of pre-funding what we expected that shortfall to be, we pulled back $855,000 of that pre-funding. Their shortfall may end up being less or more. I mean, we really don't know at this point, do we? No.
But I think, Jeff, when you make those comments, now that you've gone into details, we can't forget that we did fund $7.999 million, just $1,000 short of $8 million. So, the number was very substantial that we put in here.
No problem.
Right, but that's done, that doesn't impact
Exactly.
fiscal 18.
Ro-
So I-
Roland,
I-
I'm sorry, Roland, when can we get anything from Nathaniel Witherall? We get our monthly mailing from them, so I have numbers through the end of May. When will we
We will have
understand?
a pretty good idea in terms of how we ended the year sometime next week.
Both for Nathaniel Witherall and all the departments?
Everybody.
Okay, so we'll get preliminary actuals at that point.
Some things that will change are the accruals for like 60 days. both revenue and expense.
Okay.
We'll have a decent idea at the end.
That's very
Next week.
helpful.
There are
Okay.
5 additional beds that are just going into service now, I believe. So, I mean, and what we're looking at here is an anticipation of the dollar figures in a year that we haven't begun yet. So, I mean, to some extent, your projections of how you expect them to perform, you should be beginning to draw those projections from what the experience is with the additional 5 beds in place, and hopefully filled with cash-paying patients.
Right. So I think what we need is, by the time we get to September, we need to be able to say with some clarity what's in and what's not in some of these key numbers, so that some of it is actuals, which will be better or worse than what we're showing here, and some of it will be us having to make judgments about how optimistic or pessimistic we want to be. So we don't have to worry too much about these numbers now. These are directional numbers. But we do, as we are in this conversation, need to highlight the things that are issues.
Could I make a request, Jim?
Sure.
There's going to come a point, maybe at about 6:30 or something, we're going to take a little break between this meeting and the VET meeting. I wonder if Roland might have an opportunity to run these various projections, including the 1%, using the same assumptions on all of them. I think I noted 4 where your assumptions were different. One was healthcare, one was property tax revenue, one was the school lunch fund, and the last one was risk fund. There were 4, I think.
I had 2.5 left, so I started that, and I just changed the
That's
numbers
okay.
to match
Yeah, I
yours.
don't mind how you got there, but I thought maybe
Yeah.
for the sake of the
Yeah.
VET meeting, we could have corrected projections in
Yeah.
front of us.
Okay.
And again, the one, as, just add,
And we'll
is
save you some
proposed by the
pizza.
BOC RTM too, just so that.
Yeah, he isn't going to be able to run that now, because that's too many, I think, too many things for you to change on the fly,
There's a lot, you know.
Well,
because he has to do it department by department to get to what they
No,
voted for.
I mean, what's reasonable by the 1st of August, Roland, or is that just still take Roland? Because I know you have year-end closings, beginning of August or
It will
something.
be applied against the 16-17 budget.
Yeah.
Okay. Jim, just the other piece of information we'll want also by September is where fund balance lands.
Sure.
You know, we keep hearing the 37.5 as an estimate. You guys feeling comfortable that that's probably still a good estimate?
I think we'll be close to there. I think that the shortfall in the general fund is going to be offset by increases in the risk fund. Because
Okay.
we increased the funding by $1 million over
Right.
500, and we've already given back $1.5 million in capital closeouts to the capital fund,
Mhm.
plus the golf course repayment. So the $2 million shortfall in the general fund, not shortfall, but less than we thought, will be offset by those other 2. So
I
we'll
think
be-
still 37.
I think we'll be pretty
Pretty close to that, okay.
Okay. So now, let's take a look at the 2 pages of capital budget information here. What I asked Roland to do was run 2 simple scenarios. One is that the entirety of the capital budget for the foreseeable future is $35 million, year after year after year, because that is the way people are defining maintenance CapEx, roughly the current maintenance CapEx number. There probably are some things in there that we could debate, but for our purposes, what I was interested in was what it was going to show us at the bottom. And then the second sheet says, if maintenance CapEx is exactly 35, and we budget another 10 million for incremental CapEx year after year after year, what does that do to us? Okay?
Can I ask you a question, though? I mean, if you go back to our budget book, and there's, 5 different categories of capital spending that we have, and one of which is called maintenance, and that total was $25.4 million
Roland?
for fiscal 17.
Yeah,
So what are we
well-
including now?
Like I said, some of this wording here became the date on what something's called.
Right.
If you replace something, it's a replacement. And a lot of times you say when you replace it, it should be better than what I replaced it with. If that's possible, so now it becomes an upgrade. And so
Okay.
I think the maintenance is really all those kind of things. And it excludes those new initiatives that we didn't have before, whether it's a new building or a new project, anything like that.
So using the current terminology, you took maintenance plus replacements plus upgrades? Is that what you did?
To large. I have to thank Ben for giving me that number. He went back 7 years to come up with what maintenance looked like over
Okay.
that time period, what the average numbers were.
Okay.
And in the past, we've always talked about $30-35 million in that range.
Right.
We did 10 for the school,
Right.
highway.
I mean, you can debate a lot of this. For
Sure.
example, the new Lev school is not under new projects, but under an ongoing initiative. And maybe that's because we gave them A&E the year before.
And the reason we describe it that is because we already approved that
Right.
part of it, so we're not going to basically reevaluate the project again.
Yep.
Mary Lee, I agree with you. I think that we do need to look at this. I mean, I think this was a wonderful kind of overview and a good way to get started. But it's an overview, sort of working from the top down, and it might give departments an impression that they're going to get their pro rata share, and that might not be the best way to, begin to manage this, as perhaps I think you're suggesting.
Well, I'm not suggesting what you're saying. What I'm trying to do is just illustrate some math here. So before we get into where this might go, I'm sort of back to the Drake-Weissler capital model, okay? If you look at the first page and go all the way down to the bottom, which shows total outstanding debt, if we only spend 35 million as opposed to 50 million, just to pick a different number for a second, then the debt number starts at 189 million and declines to 77 million over this time period. But if you go to the next page, where in addition to the 35 million, you spend another 10 year after year, the 194 becomes 234. So I did one other thing in here. I said to Roland, when the capital levy, tax levy reaches 50 million, flatten it at 50 million, which happens almost immediately in this model. So the point of the story is we've been spending much more than 45 million a year. And 15 years ago, we said we would flatten the capital tax levy at about 50 million when we got to 50. And what this says is if we do that, the borrowings will reach 234 million as opposed to declining. And the little warning signal that goes with that is that we gave $400,000 to the Board of Ed budget this year to go look at their capital spending plans. And those current plans don't have any more schools in them. So it's pretty likely that they're going to want to put more capital dollars into some of these out years, which leads you to either planning on adding school capital spending and deleting other people's capital spending from the 35 or 45 million, or it leads you to raising taxes more, not leveling off at 50 million, but continuing to add more capital tax levy year after year after year. Or borrowing longer term.
That's an option.
Which helps you for a while, but then it catches up with you. But it helps you for a while. So This is just mathematics, okay? All I'm trying to do tonight is get us all seeing the numbers about the same way. And we've already found some things to correct, and that's fine.
Questions?
Yeah.
One of the observations I'm sure you realize about this is that there are certain years in both of these models when you're outside of the restriction in the debt policy that says debt service is to be no more than 70% of the capital tax levy. Is that something you?
Yeah, I just ignored that.
You ignored, okay.
Just to do this math.
Okay.
Because that's our policy. We could decide to ignore it or not as we see fit.
Can you help us understand why 50 is a reasonable number? Is that?
That's a good question.
Does that have a connection to the total infrastructure in this town that we need to maintain? Or is that derived more from we're working backwards off of where we want the debt levels to be at the bottom of this page?
Yeah, so when that number was chosen 10, 15 years ago, a couple of things were different from what we have today. One of them was we didn't have an auditorium project that was nowhere on the horizon. We had rougher estimates for what school projects were going to look like. We didn't have a Hamilton Avenue project. We didn't have a new Leb project. So what's happened in the interim, so what 50 million did was it actually allowed you to bring the capital borrowing numbers down in this time period that we're looking at here. But what's happened in the real world, which is why I made the comment about the $400,000, is that we're spending more money in the out years now than we had in the plan when we drew the plan 15 years ago. And that's going to happen again. So 50 million isn't enough if you're going to, in fact, as you point out, it violates some of the existing policies. So 50 million isn't enough unless you're prepared to make some other changes. Now, the 50 million was also about 10 or 12% of the maximum budget that we were looking at back then. And it's still sort of 10 or 12%. That number turned out to be quite accurate. All we needed was a recession to make it come true, right? We cut back on spending during the recession, and that caused the 15-year forecast to appear to have been very smart, when in fact it was, if a recession is a lucky thing, the recession helped us out.
But we've been increasing the capital tax levy by $3 million a year. The first year in your projections at the 47, the 50 is merely a last step, and then it flattens out.
Right.
In our budgeting process, we've been accommodating $3 million increases budget year by budget year every year.
Yeah.
The $50 million makes the assumption of let's stop doing that and stay static at a given point.
Right. Not because I'm recommending it, because I want us to see what happens when we do that. And part of the reason I did that was because when that was originally set up, it wasn't $3 million. It was 1% additional increase in the mill rate. The mill rate was conceived in those days as a 2.5% increase plus 1% for capital. So in those days, 1% was around $3 million. Today, 1% would be $3 million,
This year, $7 million, $70 million. So, and the year following that, it becomes 45. I mean, it varies a lot. We have new Leb in the.
No, 1% of the grand list.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The one,
I thought
or
you
not
meant
of the grand list,
budget.
the 1% increase.
3/8.
3.8, yeah. So if we'd been following the old formula,
Mm-hmm.
the 1% formula as opposed to the $3 million a year, we would have been a approaching 4 million. in
But
the
instead
last
of going
few
up by
years.
3.8, I mean, one of the scenarios you could run, also just a curiosity question, is just to continue to have the capital tax levy increase by this arbitrary $3 million a year, and as long as you're doing that, see what happens to the total indebtedness at the bottom of the page.
Yeah, well, and if I could remember how to do series mathematics, I would have a formula in my head that would allow us to do it. But what you can see up above is the difference in the first two lines, in the far right-hand column, the capital projects total $545 million.
Right.
And in the next page, they also total $545 million. But the second line, which has the adjustments, actually went down 20 million on the first page, but it goes up 129 million on the second page.
What is that
So-
line, actually?
Well, those are the projects you're not doing.
That's right, the projects you're
To
not
bring
doing.
it down to 35.
On the
That
first
bring it
page.
down to 35 or 45.
Right, on the first page.
That's the
projects-
adjustment you have to make to stay with the static 35 or 45, depending on which
Correct.
page you're on.
Right,
Correct.
but on the,
Thank you.
but on the second page, the adjustment is actually a positive 128 million.
But
So
we're-
that's how much more you can do over that time period than you could do. And then we ought to be able to figure out the answer to the question you asked, which is how much would we, if we just let the 3 million add every year, how much would that add up to? What we know for sure is that 10 years from now, it would add another $30 million in revenue.
But the other,
Plus the interest value.
the other question, though, that comes up is, while we're looking at that top-line number, is how valid are these numbers, particularly in the
Yes.
out years? I think we all know that they're more realistic, closer to the present. The Board of Ed is about to conduct a big capital plan, a big long-term capital plan that will help inform these numbers. I know the library has retained a consultant and done that a couple years ago, but I'm not sure how real some of these numbers are, and having been on the BTET enough to see the capital books change, numbers move around, projects move around in different years, they change totals, and not only that, these numbers are all in current year dollars. There's no inflation factor, I believe, in any of these
And
out-year
the
numbers.
source of the figures is very soft, too.
Right.
Yeah,
So-
once you get more than a couple of years out.
So after, you know, call it 2, 3, 4, 5 years, it's hard to be able to say with a straight face that the total spending is $545 million in this time period.
And of course, it isn't inflation adjusted. I mean, that's one of the,
That's the
our other
point.
issues. I mean, I want to come back.
Fortunately, there is no inflation.
Well, right now, we happen to be in a period where there isn't, and
Yeah.
but we're not looking at our budget in those kind of viewpoint. I want to just bring back whether it's 35 or 45 or 30 or 25, and then I'll address just a couple of details thereafter, but on specifics. But, I went back and I looked at, the overall total of encumbrances and available budget at this point, what we're carrying over from the past years. And right now, there's $109 million of projects that, 30 million of encumbered and $79 million of available budget that we're carrying forward. And then when you add this year's projects that just, the money became available on July 1st, when you add, the sewer division and the rest of the funds in addition to the general fund, that brings that another $80 million in for this year that we've just approved. That's going to that is already available, and that's a total of $189 million of capital projects that have been appropriated and that need to be completed. So we have been approving these projects. This money hasn't been returned to the town, and right now, I think it's important, even as we look ahead to these projects, to make sure that this $189 million of projects are brought in as close to on time and on budget, and that we're really focused on those issues as obviously continuing our maintenance programs and so forth that are important, but I just wanted to kind of raise that as we're all together, and I'm happy to email my sheet or numbers if anyone wants the detail, to this committee or to Roland for circulation for others. I just took the sheets that we all have. And then the other thing that I'd like to raise is that I did go through, and, in the summertime, everyone can look at, in the summertime, in the next few days or whenever people want to do it, look at some of these capital projects. But there's a whole series of, there's about 5 of them that are basically, they're like organic turf, or they're like digital learning, or we'll call it the revaluation. I mean, there are at least 5 QOCO capital projects that really are more like operating types of projects. We put them in capital so we could take a look at them or whatever, but they've turned to be, every single year consistent, just about the same dollar. So, again, that may be one thing that we want to look at, just whether those projects should be moved from capital, obviously adjusting the capital number downward, and added to operating and giving the departments a buy for moving them into, operating in the 1 year. But should some of these projects be in capital, or should they be in operating? And then, there are other more specifics that, we can talk about at some other point in time. But, GHS soils isn't in the upcoming year as an example. There may be, I went through some of these projects with Roland, and Roland said, you're sending this budget in the wrong direction. But I do think that we have to think about moving ahead on some of these projects, and they're interlinked with things like returfing the fields at GHS and so forth. So just getting a plan in place and approved, I think, is important. But at some point, more money is going to be needed, and maybe should be considered for this upcoming year, with Amy's input in terms of, where that is. And then another project just to think about is, if we do Holly Hill, the risks and so forth, and whether that should be done as a total project within the general fund. So just moving things around. So again, the point here is not specific projects, but not just to look at the general fund alone, but other things that we either move out or in, and what happens here.
So you raise a great point, and I have a question for Roland on this. Within the debt service, Roland, what you've assumed all along is that a project gets appropriated, we start work on it. So we ban, and then 5-year bond right away. And we know, pursuant to what Leslie was talking about, projects don't always start that quickly. And we don't always have a consistent timeline on what that delay is going to be. So this whole scenario assumes immediate start of every single project that's appropriated, right,
It does. It
in the
assumes
following
it's finished-
year.
It assumes everything's finished in 2 years.
Okay. And then we're amortizing principal over 5 years.
Yeah.
So we're paying off 20% in each of these years. Okay. I mean, it's not realistic, of course, but it's how this works, how this model has always worked.
It has, because I think if I start assuming that it's going to take 4 years to get something done, you should be asking the question,
Why is that happening?
well, why are you even asking for it if you're not going to start it in 4 years?
Sure.
So I am going to pick up from there. Things like, Mary Lee is talking about, in effect, the debt needs to be pushed out more probably. I mean, our little chart here of, the $189 million shows that we were probably planning on that debt occurring much earlier. And, the projects haven't been constructed, so obviously we don't need the money for the cash flows. But, flipping it, Roland, what have you put in here? And I know Nancy's points in terms of, we're looking at the state money and pilots and all those. It's just not there, I think. But what about money that should be there, such as the state reimbursement on MISA or whatever? Have you budgeted that in, Roland, and in the in this fiscal year that you're?
We don't budget anything in the current fiscal year. We got burned a couple times, but it's in the out years. So it's in part of the overall model of where you, when we have to borrow, we're assuming that we're getting that money.
So well, I was just, sort of the next phase of MISA. I mean, we obviously got $4 million in the last fiscal year. And so the next group is not budgeted in the current fiscal year, but I do believe that we expect to complete that project this summer. So it won't be budgeted in the current fiscal year. But by the time we get to the fiscal year we're talking about, it seems to me it may be appropriate to budget in at least, say, 80% of the number, or some number that we can talk about.
The model right now assumes that if we have a $30 million project and we're going to get reimbursed, say, 50%, $50 million, the model shows we're never going to borrow $30 million. We will only borrow 15, pay debt service on 15.
Because we've got reimbursement cash
Yes.
flow coming through. Okay.
And typically, it does work if we get the reimbursement in time, that you don't have to sell the 5-year bonds at the $30 million figure.
Well, actually, you seem to have two things happening, right? The reimbursement is slower, but we also spend the money more slowly. And as I recall, Bill or Nancy, maybe you remember that the forecast was like 210, and this looks like 190.
This is lower.
It's sort of $20 million lower, and that's kind of what that's about, is the money
But
being spent.
Like on NISA, even though the first reimbursement came in quite a bit later, he's not going to borrow the money, knowing the town may have to loan the money to the project, but we're not going to borrow it, knowing that's going to come in.
Yep.
Thank you, Roland.
So, just to play off Mary Lee's point, we budgeted the $400,000 to the schools so that they could give us, because they own most of the big physical assets. We budgeted that money so that we could get better numbers from the school system. The point of having a 15-year plan is not, even though it turned out to be fairly accurate, it's not for it to be very accurate. It's for it to be instructive over, this is Mary Lee's point, over the sort of 2, 3, 4, 5-year time horizon that we're looking at when we're putting any individual year's budget together. Because that's the time period where the numbers are more accurate, though they don't always spend the money as rapidly as planned. And the point of creating this process was to try to produce a smoother result for the taxpayers. Instead of up 7, up 2, up 8, up 5. We've succeeded for a long time now in having a fairly smooth change from year to year. And over time, that number's actually come down some. I might argue it came down too much, but that's what recessions do to us. And so that predictability, even if taxpayers wish that their taxes weren't as high as they are in absolute dollars, that predictability allows the taxpayers to plan what they're going to need from year to year when they're making personal decisions. So we can't hold ourselves to being perfectly accurate for 15 years from now. But we can try to be, and we are, pretty accurate in the 2, 3, 4, 5-year time frame. And that allows us to give the taxpayer a fairly predictable result, and by the way, the department's fairly predictable estimates of how much they're going to be spending 2 or 3 years from now, because we're not jumping them up and down from year to year either.
It's good to hear.
We're trying not to, anyway. So what we want to try to do when we're doing this next year's budget is in some ways more of the same. And I think the big question we have to ask ourselves is, are the taxpayers happy enough with the dollars of taxes they're paying, given the projects that are getting done? Because we're not doing a lot of projects that taxpayers come up to us later and say, you never should have done that project. I don't get a lot of people saying we shouldn't have done the auditorium at the high school. I do get some, but I don't get a lot. So if we think the taxpayers want these projects, then we have to look ahead to the funding they're going to need and plan the funding accordingly. On the other hand, if we think what the taxpayers want is lower taxes, there's nothing in any of these numbers that lowers their taxes. All these numbers raise their taxes. All these alternative plans do is they lower the rate at which the taxes go up. And in a low inflation environment, that means that the real economic purchasing power of their tax dollars is not benefiting from inflation. So we get some people saying, I want to pay less taxes. And the BET's job is to try to figure out how to match up the requirements with that argument. And what these pieces of paper say is there's no way to pay less taxes and even keep the current operations going. So then the question becomes, well, should we increase the taxes less? And the answer to that question comes back to head count in the case of the operating budget, because that's where most of the money is, although we've had a jump up recently in fixed charges. But mostly it's head count, and in some ways the fixed charges number is driven by the head count anyway, though not the shortfalls in things like the pension fund. And Mary Lee's point again earlier was pulling back capital projects doesn't lower the tax levy for capital projects. So it might lower the amount of borrowing over time, but it doesn't lower the capital tax levy. So we can budget for $35 million instead of $50 million. Capital tax levy will be exactly the same unless we're willing to see the borrowing number not come down. Right? We can lower the capital tax levy, cut back on capital spending, and watch the borrowing number climb anyway. So,
Or you could borrow at different maturities
You
and
can.
use some of this cash flow that we save from that to borrow less out in time as well. I mean, that's one of the conclusions of the white paper from the RTM.
how's it going to get us to borrow less?
Well, we're going to, in our debt service, pay off 1/20th every year as opposed to 1/5 every year.
So that we'd be
Okay.
borrowing more.
So we're going to have extra cash on hand, which we can use to either lower taxes, get other projects done that we would have borrowed for, and then the third option being kicked around by the Finance Committee, the RTM, is to lower the off-balance sheet liabilities that we have, which total, roughly $200 million.
Right.
So we should all be clear that these are very, very helpful models, but there's another one kicking around right now. And that might be helpful to line those up with this that we've seen tonight.
And in that model, you would assume, what about that extra cash?
Well, that's what the RTM is working on, and I want to make clear it's not my model. This was a model built by 3 members of the RTM Finance Committee. But what they're working on, I think, is exactly that question: what do we do with the extra cash? And what are the constraints we build in to have a discipline around that extra cash? Do we lower taxes? Do we use it to finance capital projects that we might have borrowed for? Or do we pay these off-balance sheet liabilities down? And so that's what they're looking at right now.
I would counter that we don't necessarily have that discipline. I mean, the fact that we approved, $190 million of projects that still need to be completed at this point in time as we enter this fiscal year, means that, we need to think about what discipline we all have and what actually needs to be focused on.
We used to say, never give a politician any money, he'll just spend it. Time will tell. Looks like our meeting needs to come to an end. The next meeting starts at 7?
15.
7:15.
7:15. Okay, so we've got about 34 minutes. Is there anything else anybody, we need to vote on the minutes, don't we?
I would move, you want to take them one by one, there's two sets of minutes.
Yeah,
Sure.
we carry.
Or,
They're different. Yeah, let's just do them. That's the way we normally do it.
I would move the acceptance of the minutes of June 8th,
June 6th?
June 6th, all right.
And I would second that.
comments?
No.
All right, without objection then?
Yeah, aye.
4-0.
And I would move the acceptance of the minutes of June 7th, if I'm at least reading that one correct.
And I would second that.
Comments?
No.
All right, all in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Okay. Good. Well, thank you. That was,
Thank you.
I thought.
Thank you for putting those together, too. Really.
Well, thank Roland.
Roland, thank you.
I make a phone call, Roland has to work with her. Thank you, Roland.
That's good.